if I stumble over my words a little bit, it's because it's 89 degrees in my room right now and I have no air conditioning. So
Same here.
All right, here we go. Good morning, everyone. It's the first time I've been able to say that on this podcast. And welcome to another episode of And Another Thing. I'm your host, Drew Weisberg. Joining me always is
Isaac Wilde.
And today's topic is, again, we're always excited. But I think this one to me is very special because it's completely different than anything we've done so far. We're talking a little bit about how game mechanics and games in general can tell stories, and not video games. Rather, we're talking about our favorite card game. At least I really hope it's our favorite card game. We haven't really discussed this. Magic the Gathering from Wizards of the Coast, and our little companion piece this week is also the storytelling role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, also by Wizards of the Coast, because they make our pockets hurt because we buy a lot of their products.
Because we're just shills, so.
People are going to certainly think so after this episode.
Yeah, we're not sponsored or anything.
No, though I wish we were. If we were, that would make my the next couple months a lot cheaper for
me. Yeah.
So we'll start off today. What we thought we'd do is we talk a little bit about sort of our favorite cards and how they tell a story. I often find that a lot of my favorite cards are in some way connected to the deeper lore. So we'll do a quick rundown of the Magic universe, very quick and dirty, and we'll just get through it. Essentially, Magic as a concept exists in a multiverse, meaning dozens of universes all connected by this thing called the what's it called?
Blind Eternities, right?
Blind Eternities, that's it. And there are only a few select people who are able to walk between these universes called planeswalkers. Essentially, in Magic, you sort of role play a planeswalker, and the creatures you summon and the various spells you cast are byproducts of your abilities as a planeswalker. You can also call in other planeswalkers to assist you, and they work on a loyalty system, where certain abilities give them more loyalty, which means they'll stick around longer, or you can subtract loyalty and they'll leave because they've paid their debt to you, essentially. Everything works off a system of 5 colors: white, blue, red, green, and black, each of which representing sort of a different ideology. Isaac, would you like to go a little bit into the color ideologies in Magic?
Yeah, sure. Magic does an exceptional job not tying any one ideology too strictly to like morally good or bad, where you have red is the color of like passion and fire and fervor and energy. Black is the color of kind of sacrifice and darkness. It's the more like horror color. Blue is definitely a meditative color where it's all about control and options and thinking and planning. White is kind of the color of nobility and honor and I guess like battle prowess in a way. Mm-hmm. And finally, green is the color of growth, where it's about getting large, getting stronger, and it's about life and nature as well.
Yeah, that was a fantastic explanation. I was about to say, when you were getting to green, I was like, he's saving the best one for last. That's Isaac's favorite color to play, though I'm solidly a blue mage myself. Yeah, so what's interesting there is that there are other crossovers between the ideologies. There's a world called Ravnica where there are 10 guilds made up of the 2 color combinations, and you see the intersections of these ideologies. So the red-white, the Boros, who are the planet's police force, are very much about honor and justice, and the Selesnya, who are the white-green, take that like idea of nobility, but also combine it with that idea of growth and change. So it's interesting to see throughout the multiverse how through different color combinations, you sort of get different ideologies. There's the world of Tarkir, where the combination of white, red, and blue actually creates the Jeskai monks, versus the on the Shard of Jund, where black, red, and green turns into this sort of survival of the fittest, almost like Conan the Barbarian-esque world. And it's interesting to see how the different kinds of mana affect different affect change and create these sort of different worlds. And then 5-color is just a madhouse. it's just nutso. So we'll get right into it. We'll kind of go off one after another, and we'll talk about a couple cards that we think are sort of our favorites. We'll explain a little bit about the mechanics of a card, and in doing that, we'll explain sort of how a card works and how the game works a little bit, and then we'll explain some of the lore behind it and why we think that's a good example of these mechanics and lore. Isaac, let's begin with your first card.
Sure. So my card comes from a world called Innistrad. Innistrad is Magic's take on Gothic horror, where each of the cards is from a classic element of Gothic horror, such as vampires or werewolves or zombies or ghouls and ghosts and spirits and stuff. And Magic releases these cards in sets, and each set has a contained theme. So the first few Innistrad sets were pretty standard Eldritch horror. You had angels defending the world from demons, stuff like that. It was basic Gothic madness. But in later sets, you notice something weird start to happening. It starts building up this mystery where all of the angels that had once been protecting the world had gone mad, and you don't quite know why the angels are going mad. So the first mechanic I wanted to talk about is madness. And I have this card from one of the original sets called Incorrigible Youths, where it's just vampires who have gone mad with bloodlust. And it's a pretty simple card. It doesn't do a lot, and it just kind of reflects the basic flavor. And then from a later set, there's a card called Stromkirk Occultist, which also has the mechanic madness. But in this one, something much stranger is happening, where it's this vampire, like the original one, yet there's these weird tendrils that are kind of jagged and blocky coming out from all parts of the character's body. And she's looking at this weird, mystical, red plinth of magic. And the difference between the two cards and watching as the mechanic itself evolves with the mystery and evolves with the story was a really fun part about playing that set.
I was gonna say those sets are two of the most flavorful, and I think it's a lot of the reason why people love Innistrad as a plane is because it's got such a strong tie to its flavor. We're taking ourselves back to one of the most hated eras of Magic the Gathering with Umezawa's Jitte. So Umezawa's Jitte is a legendary artifact and an equipment from the set Betrayers of Kamigawa. So you can give it to a creature as you would maybe give a sword to a knight. In this case, you give them a Jitte. And what's interesting is the mechanic is whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage, meaning does damage to the other player, you put 2 charge counters on it. And these charge counters can be exchanged for powers. This being gaining life, making creatures weaker, or making the creature it's equipped to stronger. Now, what's interesting is, because of how easy it is to deal combat damage in certain aspects, this is one of the most powerful equipment in the game. But what's even more interesting is this is identical to how it works in the books, in the Kamigawa storybooks. Because Umezawa often uses blood that he draws from his enemies to carve kanjis into the air and be able to cast spells. So this is one of my favorite examples of a mechanic perfectly reflecting the story. And it really does show that the mechanics, as well as the art, because the art is the Jitte, backlit by the moon, covered in blood. From this image, even if you hadn't read the story, like me, you would immediately gain all the knowledge you needed about how this mechanic actually works.
Returning to this idea of, you had this Gothic horror world that slowly starts getting mad and you don't know the mystery. Well, eventually a new set is released where the mystery starts to be revealed. And you don't know fully what's happening. But in a previous set a couple of years ago, there were these creatures called the Eldrazi, which were these mystical aberrations that you couldn't ever define. They defied definition, and they were mind-blowingly powerful, and they nearly destroyed a whole world. And you thought that the protagonists of Magic's game had put an end to these Eldrazi. But in this entirely new world, you start seeing Eldrazi like emerge from the shadows. And it's really creepy because this is the first time in Magic's history that a non-planeswalker has crossed over a plane. And it's the first time that like a species has crossed plane. Players hadn't really seen anything like this. So the mechanic I wanted to talk about is called meld. Because when the Eldrazi come from this plane of Zendikar to Innistrad, the Gothic horror plane, they meld with the people that live in that plane. So you'll have these two cards. The example I'm using is called Handweir, the Writhing Township. It starts with the card that's just this town, and it starts with this card that's, I think it's just like a little girl or something, but I might be wrong about that. But if you play both of those cards in a game, you can flip them over and put them together, and you get this town that's been animated by these Eldrazi tentacles that like rises up out of the ground. And meld is just a really neat mechanic, because if you're like me and you come into this environment at a pre-release where you don't get to purchase all of the cards online, but you're stuck with what you're given, the pleasure of accidentally finding two meld cards that fit together is really neat. And more than just like the gameplay pleasure, there's like the art is really genuinely horrifying. They did a terrific job capturing how ragged and disgusting this eldritch abominations were.
I'm going to reveal my next card, which is no surprise to Isaac as well, is a Johnny Mentor of Heroes. Now, this is our first Planeswalker on the show. That sounded like I was about to introduce him as a guest. And now
if only.
We have a fictional Catman. So what's interesting is Ajani began life as a mono-white Planeswalker. But what was interesting was we were seeing in his first card, we were seeing Ajani in sort of the middle arc of his story. Originally, Ajani is a Leonin from the world of Naya. And so Naya is one of the various shards of Alara, which all represent 3 color combinations in Magic, those being Naya being red, green, and white. And so Ajani was a Leonin, which is essentially a giant cat man. And what was interesting was he was an albino Leonin. So his fur is pure white. And it was often looked upon as though he was sort of an outcast or a curse. But in reality, he was an incredibly talented soul mage. He had a very deep connection to white mana and the ability to heal. Now, what's interesting is that on the card I'm talking about, Ajani Mentor of Heroes, he is green-white. But in his original story, he was mono-white. What's interesting is Ajani became red-white for a brief period as he went on this sort of vengeance quest. And only gradually did he lose that white color, or that red color identity, moved into white, which is where we see his first card. And then he eventually met, through various adventures and by meeting various people throughout the multiverse and being this healer and being this sort of great leader and this great symbol of strength, he eventually sort of adopted the green color identity. And he became the card that I'm talking about, Ajani Mentor of Heroes. And this comes from the world of Theros, which is the Greek mythology plane of Magic. And his abilities deal a lot with that idea of mentorship and about growth and about strength. What I love about this particular incarnation of Ajani is that this shows through mechanics and how, and the title is perfect, Mentor of Heroes, because it shows that Ajani is adopting that almost Chiron-esque role that you see in Greek mythology. And there wasn't really anyone like that in Theros who was this kind of mentor figure, which is a role that's often assumed in myth. And with in this case, Ajani either gives +1/+1 counters to creatures, so he's making them bigger and making them stronger and making them tougher, or he's searching the top cards of your deck and looking for certain cards that you can put into your hand. And so it sort of shows that his role on Theros was not necessarily one of it was a new role for him. It was that idea of making things stronger rather than healing, rather than sort of restoring what was. He's building up something new.
One of the most recent sets that Magic put out was called War of the Spark. And War of the Spark is a really interesting set because it's the first time Magic has told a story across like 10 sets. It's like the depth of how established this story was is really mind-blowing. This character, Nicol Bolas, and for the last like 5 or 6 sets, the storyline is focused on Nicol Bolas coming to a plane, like destroying it for a single item. The one such item is a planar bridge. I'm trying to remember what the other ones were. If you can hop in here, Drew.
Sure, it was a planar bridge, which would allow travel of non-planeswalkers between planes. It was the Eternal Sun, which is an artifact from the Mesoamerican flavored world Ixalan that keeps planeswalkers bound to one plane and is a massive power source. An army of Lazotep, which is sort of an anti-magic armor, covered undead zombies from the Egyptian-themed world of Amonkhet.
But finally, it all comes together in the set War of the Spark, where Nicol Bolas arrives on the plane in sudden fashion, the plane of Ravnica, which has previously been like Magic's most staple plane. If you think of Magic, you're probably thinking of Ravnica, which is like this city with all of the different colors. It's classic fantasy in many ways. It represents Magic the Gathering in a lot of ways. And he arrives on this plane that represents Magic's foundation, and just an army washes out of the massive portal that he's created. And so the card I wanted to talk about is called Emergence Zone. It's a land. It's a very simple effect. Honestly, the mechanic is not terribly worth mentioning. It allows you to cast cards more rapidly than your opponent, like a blitzkrieg style attack that representing what Nicol Bolas, how fast this sudden emergence is. But the artwork is really what captures me, where you have this city of Ravnica whose landscape you've come used to. The card arts are very good about repeating these landmarks that you recognize. And you watch as Nicol Bolas's distinctive horns erupt in the middle of the city, and this shockwave just blows apart all of these familiar landmarks. And what was cool about this card was, from a very meta perspective, I had been excited for War of the Spark, and this was one of the first cards spoiled. So my first look at the set was this image of Nicol Bolas arriving in full force.
I distinctly remember, though, this was one of the most exciting times, I think, that I've had playing Magic, was when it was very cool to watch our friend group kind of just every night we'd kind of come together and be like, okay, what was spoiled today? Like, okay, what can we put together about the story? Shall we move on briefly to our discussion on Dungeons and Dragons? Sort of a different telling of D&D is sort of a different way to tell a story. That being, instead of the cards and the art, you make the story. The people playing sort of tell the story. It's often referred to as sort of group storytelling. But Isaac, this is in fact your power alley, so I'm going to let you go. Because Isaac is a dungeon master. He's the guy who runs the game itself, usually. So please tell us a little bit about your role, Isaac.
Yeah. So when you mentioned that you were thinking of doing this topic, I was like, oh, I kind of want to talk to Dungeons and Dragons. Because in my mind, the two games, while very different mechanically, have a similar challenge when it comes to storytelling. My role as the dungeon master is to create a world for my players to interact with. Wizards of the Coast is a lot like the dungeon master for Magic the Gathering, where they create these worlds in these cards and then let the players play with those cards to create their own stories. And the unique storytelling challenge this presents is, how do you tell a story when you're not in control of the main characters? And Wizards of the Coast and Dungeon Masters approach this in similar ways, where they have like these, I like the term crucible, where it comes from chemistry, where you have the ceramic cup that holds all of the chemicals together and beneath the fire. So in Dungeons and Dragons, a crucible might be like the king ordering you at guard point to solve a quest for him. And in Magic, the crucible is the game itself, where you have to defeat your opponent using the best means necessary. And in both cases, the Wizards of the Coast and me as a dungeon master, we have to design to encourage the crucible and to manipulate the crucible and to hide the fact that there even is a crucible at all from the players. Breaking away from the comparison between Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons is a really neat example of group storytelling. As you mentioned, there's honestly not much like it in the world except for imaginary games you played as a kid. Like, my first experience with Dungeons and Dragons was probably me and some friends in a woods pretending we were elves, right? And it brings you back to that like childish joy of imagination, yet with enough rules to make it feel adult. There's guidelines and mechanics and stuff. Dungeons and Dragons does a neat job of encouraging the storytelling through the mechanics. Where you have, let's say a fighter, you want to play a fighter, you're given a choice of mechanics such as, do you want to be a battle master where you can control the battlefield, or a champion where you can deal critical damage with attacks. And as you choose these different mechanics, it alters the way the story is told and the way you describe your character. And that's why I felt like this was relevant as well, is because Magic is in many ways similar, where the mechanics you choose to put in this deck of cards you play with tell the story on the battlefield.
And to an extent, they tell the story of you in certain aspects. Of course, you can create decks that don't reflect you. You can create characters that don't reflect you in D&D. But I often find myself creating characters that are based off an aspect of myself that I would like to idealize. I think, Isaac kind of knows that I'm a bit of a power gamer. I really enjoy making powerful characters that feel kind of heroic. I like playing big, splashy characters. But I do find that idea of using mechanics to express yourself, that idea that a monk might not be the most powerful class for a while. In fact, I'd say from the get-go, they're one of the sort of
weakest classes.
Yeah, they're one of the weaker classes. And so but as you go through the game, they will eventually get stronger to the point where they can catch projectiles and hurl them back at your enemies. They can
run on water.
They can walk on water. They become faster than any other class after a certain point. So there's this interesting interplay of, I've heard it best described in earlier editions, where wizards would start out really weak. They would die in one hit. And fighters would start out up here. And eventually this sort of paths would cross where you'd have this point where fighters' usefulness would sort of plateau and wizards would just become these gods as you got into this higher level. And so I always find that interesting, is that idea of the mechanics illustrating the journey.
If you put your personality in the deck that you build, for instance, I always build mono green decks. which are full of these massive stompy creatures that are just a joy to watch like trample each other. It's like picking up your toys and mashing them together. And I've made D&D characters the same way. I built the 1,000 health barbarian who never dies and just kind of like runs with his axe. Like that's what I find enjoyable, are these like little juggernauts. And the game mechanics, I feel so rewarded from playing them. I feel like there's so much opportunity for me to express myself in both ways.
I agree. Sort of our favorite, I think it's fair to say Commander is our favorite format. Our favorite format of Magic is the 100 card singleton format, which basically means you can only play one copy of every card. And dictated by the sort of colors of a commander, which is a legendary creature. In my case, my favorite deck is based around Nekusar the Mindrazor, who has the identity of Grixis, which is red, black, blue, and so I can only play red, black, and blue cards in the deck, or combinations therein. And what I find so great about Commander is that it's exactly what Isaac's talking about. It's that idea of expressing yourself. I describe my Nekusar deck. It does not really have a consistent theme. The theme, I say, is this is sort of a museum to what I love about Magic. There's a beauty in that, is being able to say, this is not perfect, but it is mine, and I love it. And it's the beauty of these games is they are as much of yourself as you want to put in. With that, I think we've come to the end of another wonderful episode here on And Another Thing. I gotta say, this was probably one of my favorites so far of the 4 we've done.
Yeah, this was fun to do. I like talking about this game so much.
Oh yeah, these games are great, and I the problem is now I just want to play them, but you know we're all stuck apart from each other, so we'll just drum up our own excitement and get ready for the next.
I've been building a commander deck.
I'm building one too. I'm building a weird one, but we'll have to see what it looks like. We'll have to see what it looks like after things calm down a little bit. But we'll see you on the next episode of And Another Thing. So from us here at And Another Thing, just stay safe and enjoy yourselves, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.